Greetings everyone and welcome to week 13 in which we'll be looking at Florence's encounter with foreigners and foreigners' encounters with Florence in the late 17th into the late 18th centuries. As we recall from previous week's discussion about Tuscany's connections with the outside world, from the end of the 16th century onwards, partially because of the growth of Livorno and partially because of the rise in popularity and ease of travel, Tuscany witnessed an influx of stranieri, or foreigners, like never before. Some came to trade and do business, but many others came for pleasure and education, and increasingly to appreciate art, architecture, and later the field that would come to be known as archaeology. So let's talk a little bit about who the grand tourists were and where exactly they went. So these were, generally speaking, the sons of noblemen of the aristocracy or of well-to-do merchants, bankers, generally anyone who had the means and the social connections to send their offspring, most of the time sons, sometimes young women would go with tutors, but generally it's a rite of passage for young men from well-to-do, well-educated families. It serves as a sort of finishing school for them. They would generally be accompanied by a tutor known as a bear leader, and if they were coming, say, as this map depicts, from Great Britain, they would generally leave from Dover, and they could proceed overland or by boat to Florence, which was one of the main stops on the Grand Tour. They would also travel through, of course, France. If they were to go overland, they would generally stop in Paris first, then come down across the Alps through Italy, and then occasionally would also visit Vienna in Austria, then travel through Germany, what would become Prussia actually, through the Germanic speaking lands, and then through the Low Countries, through the Netherlands essentially, and then back to Great Britain. But aside from noblemen's sons who were undertaking the Grand Tour as a sort of educational experience, but also as an opportunity to have sort of a year abroad, as many students do today, and also to get usually into all sorts of trouble. More talk about that later. But aside the noblemen's sons who are traveling, you also have independent scholars, artists, and other intellectuals from the academic set who are bent on seeing some of the marvels of ancient Rome and antiquity for themselves. Hence, the Grand Tour is opening up to a broader spectrum of people as the 18th century wears on, for a number of reasons. There is a greater access to disposable income in places like England, France, and some parts of Austria. So people have essentially more money to spend on activities such as travel. And the times are changing as well. We find that people are simply traveling more because it's both easier and safer to a great extent. But we're entering really what's known as the great age of sociability. As we've talked about before, you have intellectuals coming together at clubs and academies. But also, there's a shift that we see during the 17th century in Europe from places of gathering, even among ordinary people. There's a switch from, for example, the tavern to the coffee house. And some scholars have read this as being absolutely fundamental in producing such colossal movements even as the Enlightenment. So just from a depressant to a stimulant, essentially, we see a rise in more intellectual activity across Europe of a certain stripe in the 17th and 18th centuries, and the Grand Tour is part of this. of these scholar grand tourists that we see traveling to Florence in the late 17th and 18th centuries are people like, for example, James Boswell, who will show up in your secondary source reading for this week. He is the noted biographer of Samuel Johnson, and Samuel Johnson produces the first comprehensive dictionary of the English language in the mid-18th century. And again, the fact that we have organized efforts to systematize language, just as we have in the Linnaean system, if we'll recall from the previous weeks, to systematize the world around us and the hunt for universal laws, such as those provided by Newton, is part of a general shift in the kind of European zeitgeist, if you will, the kind of feelings of the time towards collecting, organizing, so really giving an order and a sense of system to all the things in both the terrestrial and the celestial worlds. So this has far-reaching consequences. It has linguistic consequences, as we see with Samuel Johnson, and it also has consequences for people's conception of time. And I'll talk more about this later as we move on and think more about the rise of, for example, archaeology. But you have people like Boswell, who is a kind of nobleman scholar, traveling to Italy because they want to reconnect with the past in a way that is more physical than simply reading about it. So they essentially are, well-educated men who have read all the great classics, Cicero and Ovid, and they travel to Italy in order to see the ruins of the ancient Roman civilization upon which so many of our fundamental ideas about government and society have been based. And it's this desire to get a more concrete sense also of time, of the way that history has unfolded, that produces other movements in literature besides the kind of mimicking of the classics that we've seen before, towards a grappling with the sense of human civilizational evolution. Hence, we have Edward Gibbon, who writes The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire in the mid-18th century, which is seen to be one of the first works of modern history writing, in the sense that it's built off of collected sources, which are then put together in essentially a chronological narrative to explain a great civilizational event, which is, again, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. And, of course, Gibbon was also a grand tourist. He had been to ruins in Italy, and he had traveled across the continent. So it's all kind of connected when we think about this kind of questing of Europeans to collate and organize the world around them, a sort of intellectual questing. And then there's also a very physical questing that goes along with that. It's a mobile age. And that's reflected also in the ties with the New World that manifest in other ways that might have been evident in the 17th century, which are mostly through trade. In the 18th century, after, of course, the American Revolution, we also find that you have well-to-do Americans who are also traveling to Europe to embark upon the Grand Tour, such as Joseph Allen Smith, who is pictured here on the banks of the Arno River in Florence. And it was very common to go to Europe and then have your portrait done of yourself on your Grand Tour, such as Smith has done here. And there were a bevy of portrait artists available in Venice, in Rome, and in Florence who specialized in creating these kinds of tableaus for their Grand Tourist patrons. And the Grand Tourist patron, of course, then could have this lovely painting of himself shipped back to America or to Great Britain or France and say, yes, I've been there and I've done it. And it was sort of like the 18th century equivalent of the selfie, except it's not obviously a self portrait in that sense, but it does provide photographic, if you will, evidence of the Grand Tourist celebrating and enjoying the spectacle of the Grand Tour. So in addition to noblemen's sons and to kind of um, noble scholars or well-to-do men who are interested in the history of the Italian peninsula for their own interests, there were also, during periods of political unrest, many political refugees who went to Italy to escape um, warfare in their home country, such as during the English Civil Wars in the mid 17th century. But more and more, you see also that the mania for collecting that I discussed in previous weeks is also fueling the Grand Tours. You have men who are interested not only in sort of seeing the sights, but visiting places where they can take back some of those relics of past civilizations with them. And this will become especially important as we talk about archaeology again. But also with the idea that you would go to Florence or to Rome and you would there be able to purchase antiquities, cameos, pieces of sculpture, and also portraits and other paintings that were done in the Renaissance, which were then also ending up in the private collections. This is the period in which you also have the rise of the first modern auction houses, such as Sotheby's and Christie's in the mid 18th century. And what this leads to then is a rise in the modern art market as we know it today. The popularity of the Grand Tour also produced a movement in painting, which is known as the veduta, which means sort of like the vista or the view. And the veduta is done by talented artists such as Bernardo Bellotto, who was the nephew of another very famous veduta painter, Canaletto, who was well known for painting the canals and cityscapes of Venice. But Bernardo Bellotto traveled all around Europe painting these images of city life, and at the same time, landscape paintings were also very popular. So what we see actually is a kind of reflection in the fact that Europe in the 18th century is becoming more and more urbanized. And at the same time, you also find that people are traveling with greater ease and greater frequency to these urban locations. Hence, you also have a rise in the popularity of depictions of these places. And the veduta, the view of places that were popular on the Grand Tour, such as Florence, in particular the Piazza della Signoria, which is something that every Grand Tourist had to see. These would become very popular portraits or excuse me, paintings that could be bought and then transported home for display in an individual's uh, private home. And just as these kinds of paintings later would also become popular at public auctions. So in the latter half of the 17th century, we're still in a period of art history and music history, really cultural history of Europe known as the Baroque, or in Italian the Barocco, which was a movement that starts in Rome. It follows Mannerist painting and is also spearheaded in grand part by the Catholic Church. It leads to very ornate, very detailed um, furniture and architecture. Everything is very gilded, but also it finds reflection also in music. For example, in Bach or in other 17th century musical artists that put a lot of emphasis on complexity. Um, and it's this overall kind of complexity and style of the Baroque, the kind of exuberance of detail and style that becomes very, very popular at the end of the 17th century. And this great attention to detail is also, you can see, reflected in some of these vedute that become very popular in this period. And we can contrast that with a style that follows known as Rococo in French, the Rocaille. And as part of this movement, you see a shift more towards kind of the kind of blurry pastels, scenes that straddle the line between real and mythological, such as this painting by Antoine Watteau, it's called the embarkation for Cythera, which was a mythological island in Greek mythology. And it's these types of the grand paysage, or the fêtes galantes as they're known. These are images of nobility having kind of quasi-mythological picnics in the French countryside. Um, this is part of a movement kind of towards a more aristocratic style of painting that is in part also influenced by the Grand Tour. And we'll see that also in the popularity of paintings of ruins in this period, which led certain artists such as Hubert Robert, pictured here, to imagine what their own cities and for them contemporary landmarks would look like if they had degraded in the same way that the Roman ruins had. So Robert, who is also takes time to go on the Grand Tour and has seen some of the ruins in Rome and in other places, then tries to imagine what would happen as with the Louvre. So you can see that going back to this idea of time, the Grand Tour is also important because it's starting to shift Europeans' perceptions of their own civilization and seeing themselves as part of a longer arch in the civilizational scheme of things. So seeing the ruins of Rome makes them also think about the potential futures for their own culture and their own society. But let's talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts, the nitty-gritty of the Grand Tour itself. So, if you were, for example, a well-to-do young nobleman who perhaps had either finished his courses at Oxford or Cambridge or was about to embark upon them, you might take a year off to go traveling with a tutor who would be appointed by generally your father, and you would leave from London or from Dover. And if you were traveling overland, you would pass through Calais and first visit Paris. And most of the grand tourists did choose to go overland, again via Paris, then down to the south of France, where you could visit small towns like Nice and Antibes, or you could proceed through Switzerland over the Alps and then down to Turin. Going over the mountains was an interesting experience. Generally, it took about 5 days if you were to travel on a chair that would be transported on the shoulders, essentially, of two laborers, or you might travel by mule, and that would take about 3 days or so to get through the passes going into Turin. This passage was generally preferable because it was a little bit faster in some cases, um, although it remained highly uncomfortable until the end of the 18th century because roads along the coast and over the mountains between France and Italy weren't built and really weren't reliable until generally during the Napoleonic rule. So if they made it over the mountains, safe and sound, tourists generally stopped in Turin, often not for very long, and then went on to Milan. And from Milan, there were two major routes into Italy. Usually, you could go south across the Apennines to Florence, or you could go east via Brescia to Verona, Vicenza, Padua, and then to Venice. Florence, of course, could also be reached by the sea via Livorno, where voyagers could then continue overland to Pisa and Lucca, which were two other very popular destinations. If you were to travel by ship, say again from Britain, well-to-do travelers generally hitched a ride on warships that escorted merchant convoys to ports in the Mediterranean. But again, many of these travelers were unaccustomed to sea travel, so it wasn't the most comfortable voyage. And there were, of course, the perennial dangers of shipwreck and of pirates. Even if piracy by this period, by the late 17th, certainly by the 18th century, was becoming a bit more tamed, And during the 19th century, it would be more or less eradicated completely when the newly formed American Navy would embark upon a concentrated effort to crush North African corsairs. This they did in fact from the port of Livorno, which became a base for United States shipping and hosted the first United States consulate in Italy. So again, after traveling across the Apennines to Florence, they could continue south to Rome, where it was also popular to move on to Naples, and from there to visit the preserved cities of Herculaneum and Pompeii, which during the 18th century were the sites for the very beginnings of archaeology. In Florence, one absolutely had to see the Uffizi. It was de rigueur. Every grand tourist would enjoy time perusing the Medici collections, which were on display to connected individuals. They would also attend balls or conversazioni, conversations, literally translated, which were like debates among intellectuals in a similar vein with the Salon of Paris. These would be hosted either by academies or intellectual societies, or by private individuals who would have them in their drawing rooms or sitting rooms among a number of their friends and intellectual comrades. For those who were staying in Florence and were not already put up by acquaintances or other colleagues or connections in Florence, a number of inns and hostels and hotels essentially had sprung up over the years to cater to the needs of the stranieri who were coming into Florence rather regular pace by the 18th century. One of the most famous, certainly for the English, was Carlo's in Florence. And this is a painting done by the famous painter and caricaturist Thomas Patch, who you also read a bit about in your secondary source reading. This is an interesting painting because it depicts a lighter, if you will, side of grand tourists. We hear so much about noblemen's sons and the vaunted scholarly activities of intellectuals and university members traveling about searching for the roots of Roman civilization. But the flip side of it was that there were a number of young men with lots of money and lots of free time who found themselves in Florence and got up to all sorts of unsavory activities that one happens to engage in when one studies abroad. So as we see here, we see a number of sort of dandies who are making a mess of things at poor Carlos, though he's certainly used to it by this point. And they're depicted as generally drunken, rowdy, slovenly. You see the gentleman in the center frame who is lifting up the vase to look at the stamp underneath, or to, in other ways, kind of survey the quality of the porcelain, which is something one generally wouldn't do. We have another gentleman down at the end of the table who's trying to raise a toast. He has a paper in hand, which could be something, perhaps a poem or a short speech that he's written on the marvels of Rome or something of that sort. And then we see off to the left a gentleman who is holding up what appears to be a monocle or a kind of magnifying glass. And the magnifying glass is a typical symbol of the collector and of the grand tourist in this period. It's also an object that's used greatly by caricaturists like Thomas Patch to poke fun at these men who are these supposedly very serious collectors of art, and to kind of poke at the soft underbelly of European intellectuals in this period who are, in the eyes of the caricatures at least, kind of making fools of themselves, going about Europe and prattling on and on about things which they may or may not know anything about. British visitors to Florence, in fact, became so numerous that really all foreigners in Florence came colloquially to be known as Inglesi, or English, even if they were French or German or whatnot. But they were called generally Inglesi. So if you had um, for example, a stall boy who comes running into a hotel and says, "We have three Inglesi who want to stay the night," they may or may not actually be English. They could be French or Swiss or from other European dominions. And this was in part because they had a very well established network. England and Tuscany, as we've seen already, had very strong economic ties, which were forged over the course of the 17th century. And it also meant that they had a strong diplomatic network in place. Certain British diplomats, such as Sir Horace Mann or Lord Cowper, served as sort of cultural magnets for the grand tourist. They would attract a coterie of British visitors. They organized balls, they organized these conversazioni, or trips to the countryside, visits to the Uffizi and other private collections of art. They would also organize lectures on history, philosophy, and music, and other subjects of interest that were um, subjects of interest to both dilettantes and established scholars. And crucially, they provided introductions and recommendations of one traveler to another. So you often had to have letters of introduction that would get you into these social circles. Um, there was, of course, also the opera, which by the 18th century was a full-blown social institution, which was another popular pastime of grand tourists visiting Florence. And failing that, these travelers also took with them guidebooks, which would give them recommendations of what to do and what to see. These would be written in French, German, and many other languages as they were becoming ever more popular over the course of the 18th century right across Europe. One of the most extraordinary works of art that captures really a very good sense of the cultural milieu of the Grand Tour in Florence is Johann Zoffany's Tribuna degli Uffizi, the Uffizi Tribuna. In 1772, Johann Zoffany, a German painter, was sent by Queen Charlotte of England to Florence with a letter of introduction, and he was instructed to paint all the highlights, the greatest works of art of the Grand Duke of Tuscany's collection. Um, in Italian, the Tribuna refers to the sort of semicircular or polygonal domed end of a basilica. The Tribuna at the Uffizi was designed for Francesco I de' Medici, and it was the room in which the most important works from the Medici collection of antiquities and paintings were displayed. So what Zoffany aspired to do in this particular portrait was through his own sort of composition, because he brought in art from other parts of the Medici collection and rearranged works of it, was to give a sort of cutaway, a staging of the greatest Medici pieces of art, essentially of sculptures and other collections that they had brought together in the Uffizi Palace. Excuse me, the people that we see interspersed throughout the great conflicts of works of art here in this painting are essentially connoisseurs, diplomats, travelers. There's even Zoffany himself, who's in the back left, holding up the painting of Raphael's Madonna, along with a number of the quote-unquote traveling boys, the grand tourists, and other resident, mostly Englishmen, in Florence this time, who were known to be collectors and admirers of art. In fact, one of them, George Nassau Clavering, who is Lord Cowper, you'll be reading some of his letters next week, and Sir Horace Mann, again, who is the British representative the diplomatic representative in Florence, helped Zoffany to collect a lot of these paintings to get access to them that were normally not displayed in the Tribuna, so in other parts of the Uffizi collection. And again, we see George Nassau Clavering, Lord Cowper, is in the back. He's admiring the portrait of Raphael that's being held up by Zoffany himself. In total, Zoffany spent about 5 years working on the Tribuna. And unfortunately, in the end, the royal family of England was not 100% happy with the result. They didn't feel that it was appropriate that he had included the portraits of so many other diplomats and connoisseurs in this commissioned work, which was supposed to depict really the masterpieces of the Medici collection, such as Titian's Venus, which we see, the reclining nude in the center, and the very, very famous Venus de Medici, the Medici Venus statue, which you see pictured off on the right. It was popular among grand tourists to sort of go and have a press the bottom of the Venus de Medici, which, according to some accounts, is why the marble there is so shiny. So you learn something new every day. So there's a kind of constant tension between the refinement of the Grand Tour and then sort of the vulgarity that also happens kind of behind the scenes. But we might think of the Tribuna also as being a sort of logical combination of the collecting spirit and the organizing spirit that had been driving intellectuals in Europe for a good 200 years by this point. If we think back to the Wunderkammer, the Cabinet of Curiosities from our previous week's lectures, we see that it has certain elements in common with this. In this case, of course, it's the collecting of great art over the centuries. We see everything from Greek sculpture right up to Titian's Venus. So again, we also have this sense of time, of progression, which is reflected certainly in other works of literature that we've read for this course, such as Giorgio Vasari's Lives of the Artists. So it's this kind of sense of progression of time and of sort of organization of time around great civilizational achievements, such as the development of art, that also draws grand tourists to the Italian peninsula. And it's also very fundamental in shaping the rise of archaeology as a field of science in the 18th century in Italy and across the continent. So archaeology has its roots in antiquarianism. Antiquarianism, which again is part of the larger kind of collecting spirit that is prevalent throughout Europe in the early modern period. So antiquarians are those who study history, ancient artifacts, manuscripts, and historical sites. And there are those who collect them, again, and display them in these cabinets of curiosity, the Wunderkammern. So they're generally well-to-do people who have private collections. They were men predominantly, though there were certainly some women, who focused on empirical evidence again. So it's this sense of late 17th, 18th century becoming a real age of reason, which will later be called, the Enlightenment. But the focus is on rationality, on reason, and on empiricism, on observation, and gathering data and making conclusions from that data about the nature of the subject under study. So it's this outlook that drives the rising field or the emerging field of archaeology. One could say that archaeology begins in Italy with the works of Flavio Biondo, who was a Renaissance humanist who created a guide to the ruins and topography of ancient Rome, very systematic in its nature. But this is back in the early 15th century. And this is why he's been considered one of the founding fathers of archaeology. But the others are a number of other Italians and Englishmen and also French and German, so it's kind of a pan-continental effort of the scholars who came to southern Italy, again as part of the Grand Tour, and then made their way down to Naples, and in particular Herculaneum, pictured here, and also Pompeii, which of course were preserved after the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. So what starts with kind of dilettantish grand tourists sort of picking through the ruins and things that are visible to the naked eye becomes a more organized excavation under the direction and permission of Charles III of Naples. And these excavations begin in Herculaneum in 1738 and in Pompeii a decade later in 1748. And in Herculaneum, some of the most famous archaeological remains, such as the theater, the baths, the basilica, and the villa of the Papyri, were discovered in 1768 by some of these researchers. The villa of the Papyri is a private house that was located in the ancient Roman city of Herculaneum, which is again about halfway up the slope of Mount Vesuvius. It's a house that was supposedly owned by Julius Caesar's father-in-law, and this was first excavated between 1750 and 1765 by Karl Weber, who was as his name suggests, a German archaeologist, early archaeologist, who tunneled down into the ash deposits to reach the villa. It's called the Villa of the Papyri because of a library in the villa which houses nearly 2,000 carbonized papyrus scrolls. And these scrolls, only during the 1990s, were scientists able to kind of decipher what was written on them using, I believe, MRI technology. So they're known as the Herculaneum Papyri. And a number of grand tourists, after these excavations get underway, make this regular stop on their tours, and they're really astonished by what they find and the richness of essentially Roman civilization at this point. Everything from depictions of people eating with utensils, even like forks and knives, which, as we recall, the fork was something that came into continental European table manners only during the Renaissance. So it's still, for Europeans, it's only, the fork itself has only been around for, at everyone's table, maybe 200 years. And here they are seeing it, another utensil used on Roman place settings. But not only that, there's also other images which are very titillating, such as the kind of erotic frescoes that are done on the bathhouses in Herculaneum. So it depicts really a civilization that is well developed and detailed at every level, and it becomes a subject of much fascination for European observers in this period. And not only Europeans, in fact, many of the early Americans also made their way to Italy, again, as part of the Grand Tour, coming down often through Florence, ending up in the southern part of the peninsula. People such as Thomas Jefferson actually went back to the United States and started excavating Native American burial mounds, probably influenced by the archaeological excavations that he had seen during his time on the Grand Tour. So it's something that's becoming really not just a Europe-wide, but a kind of international movement in the move towards excavating quite literally the past. It is problematic, though, however exciting and however illuminating these excavations were, they produced a number of problems for later scholars and archaeologists. First, in the sense that archaeology became a kind of competition. If we'll recall that during the late 18th century, what we see opening up are the first kind of national public museums. And just as the Wunderkammern and the cabinets of curiosity in the past were a way for European rulers to compete with one another and to display the brilliance of their own court, national museums that are starting to be established at the very end of the 18th century, going into the 19th century, become a way also for displaying the prowess and the cultural superiority of a given European dominion. So you have the beginning of the British Museum, for example, in um, in London in the 18th century, just as other museums like such as the Louvre and the Uffizi are organized in Paris and Florence and wherever else. So you have these national museums then that were hiring people to go out and collect artifacts and to contribute to these excavations, but not simply to excavate and then bring back sketchings, but they actually wanted the real deal. So parts of the excavation itself were being carted away. This, for example, if you've ever heard about the Elgin, depending upon your pronunciation, the Elgin marbles debate, uh, this was when in 1803 the Elgin marbles, which should belong in the Parthenon in Greece, in Athens, were taken away by Thomas Bruce and were put into what is now the British Museum. And there's been a constant debate about whether or not they should be repatriated. Yeah, so this was one problem. Another problem was the fact that Italians really, even if they were progressing towards a more systematic approach to archaeology, particularly through the work of some notable Italians such as Giovanni Belzoni, for example. At this point, it's still really kind of a higgledy-piggledy, disorganized approach to archaeology. It's basically digging, carting away things, and when you can't get into something, blast your way in with gunpowder, as some excavators had done at in the Great Pyramids in Egypt. So archaeology as a tool of national competition really reaches its height again at the end of the 18th century, going into the 19th century. Um, Most famously, perhaps, in Napoleon's conquest of Egypt, in which he not only brings an army, but about 500 science, scientists who were civilians, who were at that point specialists in biology and languages, in order to essentially they were brought along in order to make a full survey of ancient Egyptian culture. And it was during this period, in 1799, when the famous Rosetta Stone was discovered by Jean-François Champollion. It's now on display, curiously, at the British Museum, and you can visit it. And it was, for those of you who are not familiar with it, absolutely crucial to deciphering hieroglyphics, which until the discovery of this stone were indecipherable. You have the same text translated in three different scripts, so hieroglyphics at the top, Demotic script in the middle, and ancient Greek at the bottom. So scholars who knew their ancient Greek then compare the text, the hieroglyphics, and make heads or tails of it, which previously they were unable to do. So the Grand Tour stands as a lasting contribution not only for the fact that it represents sort of the beginnings of modern tourism, if you will, but also because it spurred the modern art market, the modern art market, and also helped contribute to the rise of archaeology as a discrete field of scientific inquiry. And it's during this period that we see certain grand tourists also who are, such as Tobias Smollett, for example, who you'll be reading this week, uh, who are having mixed reactions, let's say, to the sites that they encounter on their grand tour. Tobias Smollett was a sort of cantankerous Scottish novelist who, for reasons of health, uh, traveled to Italy. His doctor advised him that getting some fresh Italian air would help with his many ailments. And so he traveled through France to Italy, and you'll be reading some selections from his travel diary, the parts that regard our, of course, that regard our interest in Florence. And he wrote a number of novels that were of later interest to and had great influence on authors such as Charles Dickens. And he spent his sunset years, the last years of his life, living in and around Florence and Pisa and Livorno. And he died in Livorno in 1771, and you can still visit his grave, which stands in the Old English Cemetery in Livorno. And he provides a sort of spirited account of his experiences in Tuscany, which might contrast, for example, with some of the previous travelers to Italy that we've been reading, such as Robert Dallington. So going forward, as you read Smollett's account, you might keep our previous descriptions of Italy and of Tuscany in mind as you read Smollett. So, happy reading, and I look forward to seeing you all on the discussion board.